exploring how writing in public spheres remembers those unruly women and creates venues for voices that have resonated through time but have also been suppressed through time. Indeed, the continued assaults against women, not to mention people of any gender, are the subject of ongoing protests both online and on the streets. And the UN declared the theme for this year's International Women's Day, "A promise is a promise, time for action to end violence against women." I think that's a little weak. I think there's always been action. I think promises are not strong enough. We need more than that. But it's clear that violence against women has really been brought to the forefront of many discussions today. And one of our speakers will talk directly to this question. In fact, our speakers themselves are all unruly women in multiple ways. They share a commitment to recovering lost narratives, to promoting social justice, and to speaking out against violence against women. They are all affiliated with the Five College Women's Studies Research Center. Sarah Kilborne, here on screen, Jackie Castledine in the middle, Carole DeSanti on my side, and Krupa Shandilya. The first three have been research associates, and Krupa is a professor of women and gender studies at Amherst College and a member of our steering committee. So welcome to you all. Sarah Kilborne is a writer, historian, musician, and editor. She holds a degree in philosophy from Yale University and was a research fellow at the center in 1992 through 93. And she's going to be talking today about and from her book, American Phoenix, the remarkable story of William Skinner, who many of you know if you live locally or you know the history, a man who turned disaster into destiny. And she'll talk a little bit about why this fits here today. We've talked a little bit about that via email. She is a descendant of Skinner, which I think gives her insights into family history and the women in them who may sometimes be left out of the public accounts of those family histories. Jacqueline Castledine is a faculty member at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the University Without Walls program, and she was a research fellow at the center in 2005 to 2006. She's the author of Cold War, Progressives, Women's Interracial Organizing for Peace and Freedom, and she'll be talking about this book today. She has also written on gender, jazz, and justice in post-war freedom movements, and she also co-authored the volume Breaking the Wave, Women, Their Organizations, and Feminism, 1945 to 1985. She's also a co-director of the Valley Women's History Collaborative. And if you don't know about this organization, I recommend you visit their website. Carole DeSanti is known for championing independent, high-quality voices in women's fiction as an editor at, what's it called now? They just merged with Random House.
It's still called Viking Penguin.
Oh.
The merger is not yet complete. We're going to hang on to the very last one.
Okay. She's the author of The Unruly Passions of Eugenie R., which is a novel. And she'll talk about that novel today. She has been profiled in Poets and Writers magazine and also published in the Women's Review of Books. And she really is a huge supporter of many, many women writers and really has helped to establish not just a genre, but multiple genres. And as I said, she edited Ruth Ozecki's book, and you'll be able to sort of see the fruits of Carole's labor when you come to that on Wednesday. And finally, Krupa Shandilya is assistant professor in the Women and Gender Studies Department at Amherst College. And I believe she's in her third year at Amherst College. She's already established herself, and she will be talking today about the recent rape in Delhi, in India, and talk about some of the cultural representations of the body of the woman raped, I believe. She wrote an op-ed piece with another colleague at Amherst, Amrita Basu, which appeared and at least online at Al Jazeera, and I think was turned down by the New York Times, correct? Which you may want to talk about at some point. She also has a book coming out in April. She's a translator and commentator for a book, the book called The Madness of Waiting, which is a translation of a novel well, the second novel of a writer, Muhammad Adi Rushwa, I'm not sure the pronunciation, who wrote in Urdu, so this is a translation from the Urdu, and it depicts the life story of a Lucknow courtesan and poetess, Umre Jan. So I think Carole and I think there's something in common there, you'll see, in the work that they've done. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over, well, the screen over to you, Sarah. And I've asked each of our participants to speak for about 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for discussion, and then we have some refreshments for you, and we can talk a little bit about your work if you'd like to share some of your ideas. Okay, Sarah, welcome.
Hi, thanks everyone. I can't see you, but I'm glad that you can see me. You know, I'm feeling a little bit unruly today, Skyping in. I wish I could be there with you all. And I was already feeling a little bit unruly given that this is a day celebrating women, and I have written a biography of a man. But as Groucho Marx used to say, behind every successful man is a woman, and behind her is his wife. Skinner was the subject of my biography, and he was heavily influenced by his wife, who was very much, oh, there you are, I can see you all. I can also see some familiar faces in the audience. Hi, okay, back to Skinner. So Skinner was very much influenced by his wife. She was a partner to him throughout their marriage. But there were two women who had a profound impact on Skinner his entire life. And those were his mother and his Aunt Ellen, a maiden aunt with whom he lived for a few years when he was a child. Now, both of these women could be classified as unruly. His mother, with whom he did not get along, worked in a man's trade. And his aunt was educated, which was extremely unusual for a woman of her class, and Skinner admired her greatly for her achievements. Now, William Skinner, for those of you who don't know, was a silk manufacturer. And he established a silk company in this country, in America, that lasted for over 100 years. And he clothed millions, his company clothed millions of American women in silk and satin. And throughout his life, he was also surrounded by women, since most of his employees were women. And he was, okay, there you all again. Sorry, slight technical snafu. He was surrounded by women, and he very much supported a woman being independent and trying to make a way for herself, as I said, independently. In the 19th century, he supported women's education at a time when that was not only unpopular, but widely discouraged. All five of Skinner's children, all five of his daughters, I should say, were educated. They were all educated through high school. Two of them went to finishing school, and three of them even graduated from college in the 1870s and 1880s. And they went to Vassar in Poughkeepsie, and there is a Skinner Hall at Vassar College, and there is a Skinner Hall at Mount Holyoke College, and those were both given to the colleges by Skinner's children, who carried on his belief that if a woman wants to have an education, she should have it. No matter that public opinion might think that that would make her unruly and somewhat ungovernable. Now, William Skinner, when was considered to have one of the greatest comebacks in American industry. And when he was 49 years old, he lost everything in one of the worst industrial disasters in our history. It took place very near where you all are right now. It took place in the Pioneer Valley. It was the Mill River flood of 1874. And he was bankrupted in 15 minutes. He was the only manufacturer who was affected by this disaster who was able to rebuild his life and come back from ruin. And it was because he was willing to make decisions that nobody else was willing to make that he was able to rebuild his company, reestablish his company, and he ultimately became one of the most successful silk manufacturers in the world. When he died in 1902, he was a multimillionaire, and he had what was considered the largest silk mill in the country, which was just down the road from where you all are in Holyoke, Massachusetts. Now, Skinner's story, in essence, is one of disaster and survival. It's about rebuilding your life after losing everything. And he learned powerful lessons of survival and resiliency from the two women I mentioned earlier, his mother and his Aunt Ellen. I'm going to read you a few brief passages from the book that focus on that highlight these two women a little bit, but to give you some context for what I'm about to read, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Skinner's childhood. He was not American. He was born in England, in London in 1824. And he was born into East London, into a parish called Spitalfields, which some of you might have heard of. Now it is becoming somewhat of a posh place, but in the 1820s it was a slum of such poverty it was considered without parallel in the kingdom, and that's a quote. Skinner was born into a community of silk workers, and they'd been making silk for centuries, but they were so poor and they were so malnourished that they were considered to be, on the whole, a stunted and puny race of people. Average life expectancy where Skinner was born was 16 years old. Now, both of his parents were in the silk trade. His father was a dyer, or worked at a dye house, and he had a weak constitution and he died young. Skinner's mother was a silk weaver, and that was unusual for a woman. Usually only men were weavers, but she had her own loom, and that loom dominated Skinner's childhood. It took up at least half of the garret in which the family lived. Silk weavers lived on the top of houses in unfinished attics, and on either side of the room would be a row of windows. They were called long lights, and they let in light that illuminated the looms upon which the weavers worked. And Skinner grew up in this garret, helping his mother at the loom. Now, Mrs. Skinner worked about 80 hours a week, and she made the equivalent of about $65. That was actually better than being unemployed. But it shows you the extent to which she had to struggle to make a living and to support her family. She was the principal breadwinner, as I'll read in just a moment, of her family. Now, as we all know, unruly women are not always popular. They are not always good people. They do not always have savory characters. But they always make an impression, and often a significant one. And certainly Mrs. Skinner did that for her son. So, without any further ado, I'll read you a little bit from the book. Let's see. Skinner's mother, Sarah, was descended from a tough stock of Londoners who had been silk workers from generation to generation. Though weaving was typically the province of men, Sarah had learned the trade from her parents and was a weaver in her own right. She worked 14 to 16 hours a day, often 7 days a week. She was the principal breadwinner in the family, even after giving birth to 6 more children. Skinner later attributed his success in business to the industry and perseverance instilled into him by his mother. As one can imagine, this didn't come without its consequences. Mrs. Skinner was her son's first employer. By the age of 6, young Will was cleaning the warp on her loom and making the quills with which she wove. With little variance, he rose with his mother at 5:45 in the morning with the tolling of the Christchurch bell, and labored by her side until the last of the candlelight in the evening. While she sat at the loom, both hands busy, he also helped care for his younger brothers and sisters, and in due course taught them to wind thread and pick nibs the way he did. Given the need to work and little money to spend, Mrs. Skinner, like other women weavers, didn't cook. Rather, the family ate bread for most meals and perhaps a red herring or a piece of cheese. On Sundays, they had enjoyed a bit of cooked meat, something a few halfpence might buy, such as cow's heels or sheep's head from a nearby cookshop. Mrs. Skinner didn't leave off for meals during the week any more than her parents and grandparents had before her. She raised her children to accept a life of eating in one corner and weaving in the other of the same room. Although her hard work was impressive, Mrs. Skinner had some critical weakness that alienated her eldest boy, and that weakness may very well have been drinking, or abuse, or gambling brought on by the drinking. In Spitalfields, drunkenness was the regular and normal state of affairs, and alcoholism passed down through the generations as dependably as weaving and dyeing. Prior to the mid-19th century, most of the water in London was too foul for consumption. One citizen described highly colored deposits in it, so just about everyone drank something else. In Spitalfields, the cheapest two drinks were gin and beer. Will grew up on the stuff. At this time, wrote a silk broker, it was the daily custom for the London brewers to send round porter to the weavers' houses at noon. His mother would have welcomed the delivery, not only because it helped fill up her and the children's stomachs, but it provided something to look forward to at midday, other than bread. Fancy yourself, Charles Dickens remembered being told while on a tour of the district, stewed up in a stifling room all day. Imagine the lassitude into which your whole frame would collapse after 14 hours mere inhalation of a stale, bad atmosphere, to say nothing of 14 hours monotonous work in addition, and consider what stern self-denial it would require to refrain from some stimulant, a glass of bad gin perhaps, if you could get it. Young Will's first escape from the fate of his family occurred at about the age of 8, when he was sent to live with two of his father's sisters, Eleanor and Mary, to be their errand boy. This would have been a convenient way for his parents, who were welcoming their fourth child, to lower expenses at home while earning extra income from their son's employment elsewhere. Though perhaps unsettling, the move was a blessing for the boy. He was suddenly out of the confining garret, meeting people, making purchases, delivering goods, and most exciting of all, pocketing change. Eleanor, known as Ellen, was a dressmaker who ran a small shop with Mary in a nearby parish. They had been well educated, or at least better educated than most, because someone clearly taught these women the classics. Unlike Mrs. Skinner, who was illiterate and had to sign her marriage certificate with an X, Ellen and Mary could read and write with facility. According to one of Skinner's sons, it was these aunts who persuaded father to read Shakespeare. Of the two maiden aunts, Skinner was closer to the younger one, Ellen. She would have been about 22, but this was not a young age in Spitalfields. In her few surviving letters, Ellen comes off as a tender, quiet woman who adored the company of children and who deeply appreciated even the smallest gestures. Given Skinner's lasting affinity for her, she had a much-needed influence on him as a boy. By the time he went to live with her, he had already developed some of his less favorable attributes: stubbornness, impatience, impulsiveness, and forcefulness. No doubt he was a very headstrong child, prone to outbursts, filled with pent-up energy, and probably bored to the point where he was on the verge of becoming a real troublemaker. Moving into a household of adults could have been disastrous. As a lone child, he could easily have been abused, but nothing of the kind seems to have happened. On the contrary, although taken in as a worker, he found at his aunt's a place of refuge, where he was challenged daily with new tasks, such as handling orders and money and learning about things other than silk. Ellen was a businesswoman, intelligent and articulate, and Will found in her a mentor that neither of his parents could be. Within a year or two, however, at about the age of 10, he was old enough to work in the dye house where his father was employed. This meant that he could earn more money for his parents, but it also meant that he would have to leave his aunt's house. They couldn't afford to board him if he wasn't assisting them in their business. Now, when Skinner was 20 years old, he was offered an opportunity to come to America and to help a fellow Englishman who had established a dye house here in the Northampton area. It was an extraordinary opportunity and took an incredible amount of courage to accept. Most people where Skinner grew up never traveled their entire lives further than 2 miles in either direction. And here he was being offered or asked to go all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to America. And there was a great deal of question whether he'd even survive the journey. Restless as Will was, accepting the position and deciding to leave could not have been easy. A lot had changed in his life over the past few years. For one, his father had died, and he had become the male head of the family, responsible for the welfare of his mother and 6 younger siblings. As the eldest son, he was supposed to assume his father's place in the dye house, improve on it if he could, and generally look after the rest. Desertion on his part would be disastrous to what little security the family had. Moreover, leaving would mean asking his younger brother George, age 17, to take over as head of the family. George was already working at the dye house, as was their still younger brother, 14-year-old Thomas, but they did not yet share Will's seniority. Further, though his siblings were taking up their own mantles, they were simply less schooled in life than he was. They were, and always had been, more dependent. And some of them still had a lot of growing up to do in this very hostile environment. Apart from George and Thomas, they were Mary, 15, Betsy, 10, Sarah, 8, and Eleanor, who was just 5. If later behavior is any indication, Will made his decision quickly and instinctively. He may have sought counsel from Aunt Ellen or discussed the proposal with George, with whom he was very close. But having been raised to be self-reliant, he most likely made up his mind on his own. It's almost unimaginable that Mrs. Skinner would have supported her son's departure, especially after her husband's death. But John Skinner was dead, and whatever anchor he provided for the family had been sufficiently unmoored. In Will's decision, one senses a desperation not only to get away from Spitalfields, but also, finally, to get away from his mother. He wasn't the last child to desert her. Now, Skinner came to America and he made a very good life for himself here. Within a decade, he had his own silk mill, which was rather extraordinary. And around the silk mill had developed a village, which was actually called Skinnerville. And this poor kid from England literally had put his name on the American map. He returned to England 15 years later and on a business trip and decided that he would go see his mother. He went with his sister Betsy. Betsy took him, she was his favorite sister, and she took him to visit their mother. And Skinner had such a visceral reaction to seeing this woman that he literally could not speak. And there was some reason why his mother could not see him. She was either blind from so many years at the loom, she was either blind from syphilis, having resorted to prostitution to supplement the family's income. A lot of women did that. She was perhaps drunk and out of it, or she was perhaps suffering from dementia. But she had no idea that her firstborn son was standing in the room with her. And Betsy, seeing her brother's discomfort in the face of his mother, lied to their mother and said that actually she had come with her husband and not Will Skinner. And the mother never knew the difference. She had no idea that Skinner had come home after 15 years. But Skinner was in London for 2 weeks. And the second week, he decided that he had to go back and he had to make his presence known to his mother. Skinner made a decision during the second week of his stay to visit his mother one more time. He evidently now felt the courage to speak to her. He may have even wanted to give her some money. This time, he went by himself. In what must have been a cramped, poorly ventilated room, he told her what she could not see, that he was her eldest boy, William, back from America. Almost immediately, he regretted it. Her reaction was so wretched. Her reaction was as wretched as the circumstances in which she lived. And after less than an hour, Skinner found it unbearable to be with her any longer. As he walked away down the street, he felt debilitating disgust. I felt such a contempt for her, he wrote his wife afterward, that I was sick the remainder of the day. No. William Skinner used his advantage to his favor. Throughout his life, he relied on what the poverty of his childhood had taught him, that to survive one must persevere, to rise in the world one must seize opportunities, and to succeed one must make sacrifices. Regardless of what others thought, he gave his imagination free rein, listened to his own instincts, and did not let circumstance define him. He defined himself. His early years taught him the difficult truth that he alone knew what was best for him to do. Loyalty to others was important, but loyalty to himself was essential, as well as respect for the brevity of life. He repeatedly told himself and his children, time lost can never be regained. To friends and neighbors, he'd also say, the smartest horse jumps the ditch, believing that one must never back away from an obstacle, but take a leap of faith and have confidence. Because of the risks that Skinner was willing to take, he not only helped establish the silk industry in this country, but as I mentioned earlier, became one of the most successful silk manufacturers in the world, which was an ending to his story completely unimaginable given the circumstances into which he was born. He died in 1902, and during a private funeral at his house, Dr. Reed, who was pastor of the Second Congregational Church in Holyoke, recited several lines of poetry that Skinner had chosen. The lines were by an 18th century British poet and essayist known formally as Mrs. Barbauld. Her full name was Anna Letitia Barbauld. She had once written such exquisite lines of verse about life that Wordsworth himself apparently said he would rather have written them than any lines of his own. But Mrs. Barbauld was vilified in the British press when she spoke out against the British government. In a poem published in 1812, she predicted that Britain's reign was coming to an end and that the young country of America would be stealing its crown. Although Mrs. Barbauld was largely neglected in literary circles as the century wore on, some, like Skinner, did not forget her. Much of her verse was sentimental, in keeping with the fashion of her time, and thus it is somewhat unusual that Skinner chose her verse to be read at his private funeral. But it is absolutely fitting that he chose lines written by a rebel, a Briton, and a woman to voice what he could not say. Life, we've been long together, through pleasant and through cloudy weather. 'Tis hard to part when friends are dear, perhaps 'twill cost a sigh, a tear. Then steal away, give little warning, choose thine own time. Say not good night, but in some brighter clime, bid me good morning. In other words, Skinner was saying goodbye for now, till we meet again. Now, I just want to say, in closing for my brief remarks here, thank you so much to the Five College Women's Studies Research Center. I was an associate here in 1992 and 1993. And the project that I was working on then led me to the book that I just finished, American Phoenix. I came to this center to study one of Skinner's daughters. She was one of the daughters that graduated from Vassar College. Her name was Belle Skinner. Some of you might be familiar with her. And she was, talk about Unruly. She was a remarkable woman, and she legally adopted and rebuilt an entire village in France after World War I, and that village exists to this day because of her. And I was fascinated with her story and did a great deal of research on her at the center. And during the course of that stay, you know, I would wonder, well, what would inspire this woman who was then 50 years old and leading a very comfortable life to become so passionately involved in resurrecting a devastated village? And if you rewind, when Belle was 8 years old, the village into which she was born, Skinnerville, was destroyed in a flood, the Mill River flood of 1874, and it was not rebuilt. And so I began to research the flood as an inroad into Belle Skinner's story, but the flood then took over. And you know, the more I knew how Skinner's story ended, I knew how he had become a success. But as I began to appreciate how much he lost in the flood, I became all the more impressed with what he'd been able to achieve afterwards. And if I was going to tell one of those stories, the daughters or the fathers, in this instance, the father's story had to come first. But Belle Skinner is back on the table, so there's a good chance that you'll be reading about her soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So Sarah, can you stay with us for a while?
Sure, yes.
Okay, because I thought we would have questions at the end. Or
Sure, absolutely.
is that okay? Okay, great. So, thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm going to move our conversation forward probably close to 50 years, but before I do, I have to say thank you to Sarah, because as a undergraduate here at Mount Holyoke, and a history major, I spent a lot of time in Skinner Hall. So thank you, Sarah, and your family. I very much appreciated all the time I did spend there. And as I say, I'm going to move us forward just a little ways, about, like I said, about 50 years. First, I want to thank Karen for having invited me to be on this panel, to be speaking as an unruly woman, about unruly women on International Women's Day. And when I entered Mount Holyoke College as a Francis Perkins Scholar in 1997, I have to admit I knew very little about unruly women. With my feminist consciousness fully raised, 2 years later, I graduated and left for graduate school to study unruly women, women of the American left. political left. So it was with great pleasure that I returned to Mount Holyoke in 2005 and was here an associate in 2006 as well at the center, working under then director Janice Irvine, who's been a terrific influence. And I'm grateful to have this opportunity. It's almost like 15 years after having left Mount Holyoke. I have the chance to come back and report back on what I found. So it's a great opportunity for me. And I'm going to be reading from my recently published monograph, Cold War Progressives. But first I want to give you a little bit of historical background to situate my book. And my book picks up pretty much in 1948 with the election of 1948. And some of you may best remember this election for a photograph that's rather iconic now of President Harry Truman holding aloft, right, a copy of the Chicago Tribune that, as it turns out, erroneously reported Dewey beats Truman. As we know, Dewey did not, in fact, beat Truman, that Harry Truman was by a narrow margin reelected in 1948 as president. But one of the other more notable reasons to talk about that election, I'm going to argue today, is the campaign of a third-party candidate, Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was a member of the administration of FDR through the New Deal years, and in 1948, he ran as a third-party insurgent against Truman and Dewey. And he was the figurehead of the Progressive Party, and it's the women of the Progressive Party that I'm interested in and that I'm going to talk with you about today. The platform of the Progressive Party was quite progressive. It called for, including in its planks, civil rights, women's rights, labor rights, and most importantly, at the dawn of the Cold War era, it argued strongly for peace. And Wallace became known as the peace candidate. So journalists noted at the time of the campaign, as this new third party, as they called it initially, was coming together, that women played a large and a very visible role in the party. And so that's where I want to start this talk today. Cold War Progressives kind of traces the activism of these women into the party and then where they went after that. They became, many of them, grassroots and even larger kind of national figure leaders in some of the most important movements of the mid to the late 20th century. So I'm going to give you an idea of who some of these women were, just so that you know I'm not necessarily over-speaking here, okay? And I'm going to read you a paragraph from my introduction about who kind of passed through the party in 1948. Notable women who were in the party included writer, activists, Islanda Good-Robeson and Shirley Graham Du Bois, who for decades remained major forces in battling white supremacy in the U.S. and in the also in colonial Africa. Political scientist Marjorie Lansing, who in the 1980s helped to develop the concept of the gender gap to explain U.S. voting patterns. Susan B. Anthony II, who was grandniece of the suffragist and a tireless spokesperson in the 1970s for the Equal Rights Amendment. Labor organizer Catherine Clarenbach, a co-founder of the National Organization for Women. St. Louis attorney Margaret Bush Wilson, the first woman chairperson of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Newspaper publisher Charlotta Bass, the first African-American woman to run for national political office. And she would run in 1952 for vice president on the Progressive Party ticket. And Gerda Lerner and Eleanor Flexner, authors of seminal studies of U.S. women's activism, Southern civil rights and peace activists Virginia Foster Durr, Ann Braden, Coretta Scott King, whose decades-long interracial organizing served to join social justice causes, and finally Betty Friedan, who need we say more, okay? So those are some of the women who were politicized in this movement, this Henry Wallace movement, the Progressive Party movement. And because of the leftist platform that I just described, the Progressive Party had some problems, let's say. First of all, the platform was leftist, and second of all, communists were in leadership positions. In the dawn of the Cold War, communist parties were in leadership positions and very activist in this party. So Henry Wallace was accused of being a puppet of the Soviet Union. Not really so, but that was the accusation. And by the end of the brutal campaign season of 1948, he received less than 3% of the national vote. Therefore, the activism of the women I'm going to talk to you about today, though, had very real consequences. You can imagine what it was like to be associated, especially, as I say, at the dawn of the Cold War era, with these kind of progressive ideas and with some of the activists who were the figureheads of this movement. And one of the places I want to focus us today is on the significance of disruption of family relations due to the activism of these women. And so I'm going to be reading from the third chapter of my book, which is titled Progressive Mothers. At the core of U.S. leftist post-war women's activism stood a host of social justice causes, including civil rights and women's equality, but central to their activism was peace. Response to their attempts to push the boundaries of good mothering to include such endeavors as political organizing, especially peace activism that took them out of the home and challenged the emerging Cold War liberal ideology, suggests the difficulties that they would in fact face balancing the personal and political in the immediate post-war years. The experiences of a cohort of Progressive Party organizers working across the nation at both national and at local levels demonstrates how their determination to continue working for leftist causes while also performing their social roles as wives, mothers, daughters, and waged workers was increasingly complicated by domestic reaction to international events. In his study of the significance of the 1948 election, the journalist Zachary Carole introduces readers to one such woman, Vermonter Helen McMartin. McMartin served as the 1948 Progressive Party state director, and by all appearances, she represented the futility of the Wallace movement. Carole explains that the demands that McMartin experienced as an organizer attempting to keep her small state party afloat after that crushing electoral defeat of 1948 had sent her into a tailspin. Quote, people stopped giving money, stopped listening to Helen, stopped answering her letters, Carole writes. The grandmother who served cookies with Vermont milk at her campaign meetings was physically exhausted. Despite her wish that she could snap out of it soon, the author wrote that McMartin failed to recover from the malaise that gripped her following the Wallace loss, and she died in 1951. The recounting of McMartin's latter years supports a well-established narrative of the Cold War era that depicts American leftists contained by increasingly anti-communist U.S. foreign policy, at the same time that domestic containment of women valorized their role in the home. Indeed, the story appears to dramatically illustrate the post-war silencing of political women as they retreated from public view. Yet, McMartin didn't die in 1951. She died in 1987. Following nearly 40 years of leadership in Vermont social movements, and writing women like McMartin out of the narrative of social movement history has had very broad implications. Not the least of these is concealment of strong links between movements for peace, civil rights, and women's equality in mid-20th century America. Examination of the activism of McMartin and a host of Progressive Party women like her provides insight into the complexity of the lives of those who struggled in their interracial organizing to balance leftist beliefs with traditional women's roles. During the Q&A, I'm happy to answer questions you might have about how I discovered the untimely demise of Helen McMartin. Growing up in turn-of-the-century Brooklyn, New York, Helen Hawthorne McMartin learned leftist politics at the knees of her father, Daniel, who was an immigration service clerk and enthusiastic supporter of perennial socialist presidential Eugene V. Debs. Presidential candidate, Eugene V. Debs. In 1926, the single mother of two settled in the mountains of Vermont, where she held various jobs while at the same time caring for her two children. The McMartin children only occasionally saw their father, who appears to have offered little financial support. He was, in fact, from an upper-middle-class family. Motherhood, therefore, became central to Helen's life. In the mid-1930s, McMartin completed a course on social work and became a caseworker for a parental education program that was jointly funded by the state of Vermont and the federal government. At the same time, she was involved in church work and was a Parent-Teacher Association volunteer. By the time she joined the ranks of state employees in 1936 as an employment counselor, she had gained a measure of financial security as well as a degree of social standing in her community. That she was willing to jeopardize these in 1948 to work on the Wallace campaign reflects the level of her concern about world affairs and its impact on American families. In June of 1948, before the Progressive Party founding convention, which would take place the next month in Philadelphia, McMartin wrote to Wallace to plan the candidate's visit to Vermont. So Henry Wallace was traveling to Vermont for a brief campaign stop. She took advantage of the opportunity to fill him in on her difficulties as state director, which included dealing with a harsh, red-baiting local press. The fact that McMartin played a prominent role in the Vermont Wallace organization at a time when women were commonly shuffled to the political margins may have contributed to local newspapers' critical coverage of the campaign. Her complaint that the two Burlington newspapers, quote, took our money for paid ads and kept up a constant editorial barrage attacking us in Wallace, suggests that the intersection of gender and leftist politics made McMartin an easy target for her critics. The political history of Vermont is important to know here, so I'm going to give you a brief background on that. Today, it might seem a little shocking to know how conservative Vermont was at one time. So, Vermont undoubtedly, the political climate at the time undoubtedly contributed to her woes in the summer of 1948. Known as a Republican stronghold, the state's voters had not elected a Democrat to the governorship in nearly 100 years and had never sent one to Congress. And obviously, again, a little difficult for us to believe today. Vermont Republicanism did include a small and persistent liberal strain, yet in the early 1940s, the major state newspapers and their readers were solidly conservative, supporting anti-communism and castigating those they saw as subversive threats. It is safe to say that while Vermont politics in the late 40s reflected the tensions of the national political scene, it was a more conservative state than many. Despite the political climate in Vermont and around the world, if she had any doubts about Soviet actions in international events, McMartin kept them to herself. Like many in the Progressive Party, she was largely sympathetic to Soviet foreign and domestic policy. Attempting to draw attention away from debates about communism, which were dogging this Wallace campaign, McMartin instead focused with Vermont voters those issues important to mothers and to families, including the eloquent and forceful speeches of progressive women at the party's July convention. One woman in particular captivated attendees in the national media in Philadelphia with her paeans to family. African-American author and activist Shirley Graham, who would later marry W.E.B. Du Bois, about 2 years later, delivered a keynote speech that opened dramatically, quote, "I am a Negro woman come to Philadelphia to help write a platform for me and my children." She went on to frame her argument that the Progressive Party offered blacks and women the opportunity for full American citizenship in undeniably maternalistic rhetoric. In doing so, Graham spoke powerfully about the discrimination she faced in America due to her race and gender, using her identity as a mother to justify her political activism. Defying the mother-blaming stereotype of the black matriarch, Graham blamed racism for the hardships that she faced, as did other black families. Recounting the premature death of her eldest son, Robert, she spoke movingly about her attempts to obtain medical help for him. Quote, "I am only one Negro mother who has seen the doors of a great hospital closed against a dying son. I am only one of the thousands whose son fought in distant lands for freedom and democracy," and here she references World War II, "which they did not have here at home." Thus, Graham pointed out that even after successfully performing her role as a good mother and raising loyal citizens, institutional racism had robbed her of her maternal reward. To ensure that the relationship between progressive motherhood and citizenship was well understood, she concluded, quote, "This convention is resolved that these sons shall have their American heritage." It is not clear whether Helen McMartin was actually present for Graham's address. She was certainly at the convention. Present or not, however, she was moved by the speech and made reference to it in her own speech-making in Vermont. And here I want to just conclude with a discussion of the impact of radical activism such as this on families such as Helen McMartin's. Her radical politics in conservative Vermont made McMartin's return to her state job, or that she had earned with so much work there, her state job as an employment counselor following the 1948 election, out of the question. Numerous attempts to regain state employment met with failure. Despite an exemplary career with the state, where she had risen quickly through the ranks, she was forced to find alternative employment. She turned to working as a private caregiver for children and the elderly. Ironically enough, she was now an unemployed employment counselor. A resume from the mid-1950s reflects the concern that disclosing her activism in the Progressive Party would hinder her employment. Omitting the reasons for leaving the state job that she'd had, McMartin emphasized her duty to family and her maternal role, explaining that following her resignation, quote, "I spent some of the time with my daughter in New York taking care of her 2-year-old child while she completed her work at Columbia University in early childhood education." And this is somewhat interesting because the relationship between Helen McMartin and her daughter was fraught. Her daughter Margot was very, very unaccepting of Helen's radicalism and kept trying to redirect her mother's energies into more traditional organizations. And their correspondence is very interesting back and forth as daughter tries to tell mother how she's erring. McMartin claimed this gave her insight into new child care practices, preparing for future work assignments in caregiving. In the account of her immediate post-election years, she erased her Progressive Party involvement from her work record entirely, and in placing herself in the bosom of her daughter's family, she erased its impact on her family life. Now, in her journal, daughter-in-law Louise vividly details the impact of national Cold War policies on the McMartin family. Louise is married to Helen's son, who they have nicknamed Mac, so is referred to in all correspondence as Mac. I was impressed with the journal that was kept by Louise. She appears to be a very sensitive and very insightful person who really fully understood the complexity of the relationships in her family, and especially how politics were making relationships difficult. She became, for me, a very sympathetic figure. So in her journal, daughter-in-law Louise vividly details the impact of national Cold War policies on the McMartin family. Tensions had come to the fore in 1950 when Helen gave Mac, her son, and Louise, Mac's wife, a subscription to the Progressive Party's Guardian, and this was its monthly publication, and it was considered, a very radical publication. The couple canceled the subscription because they feared that the subscribers list might be used to identify, quote, dangerous persons. And because, as Mac, the son, observed, they hoped to, quote, avert any self-appointed patriot from accusing us of being communists. 2 years later, as the persecution of suspected American subversives intensified throughout the country, Mac and Louise went so far as to consider how they might, quote, go on record as not being politically associated with Mother. They went and approached Vermont Republican Senator George Aiken about their concerns. In early 1954, with Senator Joseph McCarthy increasingly drawing fire from political opponents, Louise appeared to have overcome at least some of her anxiety about national and international events. And Louise, again, she's a thoughtful person. She actually writes in her journal, which the family gave me access to, she writes about what it was like to have been raised in a very conservative family, and she understands, actually, more than many people, I think, at this time, the dangers of being an unthinking conservative. If that's not redundant. But anyway, following the televised Army McCarthy hearings in the spring of 1954, during which the senator fatally wounded himself by accusing the U.S. Army of harboring communists, Louise confessed that her earlier concerns about the danger of Soviet communism had given way to her belief that, quote, today our fear of the Soviet Union and communism is our greatest concern, our greatest danger. Still healing the family's Cold War wounds would take time, and actually I think that even upon her death, that Helen McMartin, her relationship with her daughter, while it healed somewhat, was still very painful, I think, in some ways for both of them. Concerns voiced by Louise suggest she was enormously troubled by the potentially harmful effect that family conflicts had on Helen. So even while they were aware that their tension between them and that they were contributing to it, they really were concerned, or at least Louise was very concerned about the effect it had on her mother-in-law. Strained family relations did little to diminish McMartin's enthusiasm for radical causes. Instead, she responded by forming deep friendships with like-minded activists in leftist women's networks, some of whom filled the role of family during these difficult years. And it was these networks that I trace women through at a time when organizational records no longer were available to us because so many organizations had been red-baited out of existence. Tracing these networks was really helpful to understand how women had continued in their activism through the Progressive Party in its demise in 1954, had continued even in the late 50s and early 60s, and then resurfaced as the political climate became more favorable to them. So in the early 1960s, Helen McMartin Martin would join Women's Strike for Peace and travel internationally for the first time, protesting in Vietnam and so on. And nicely enough, her daughter Margot supported this, and that became one of the things that they could actually share a little bit. Again, McMartin would mentor other women, especially in Vermont peace movements. There's some wonderful, rich sources at UVM about the peace movements of Vermont that are just waiting to be mined, I think. And so I'm going to conclude here. This is a little bit of a taste of what some of the women, Helen McMartin is one figure in my book, but some of the complications that radical activism has for women's life that are maybe less discussed than the more public, complicated lives that they lead. Thanks.
Yeah, could we get the PowerPoint, please?
Oh, it's not connected. It's checking the press here.
The PowerPoint is not, the screen seems to have frozen.
Yeah,
Can we get the PowerPoint up?
So Sarah, we're just going to put up a PowerPoint. I'm not sure you'll be able to see it, but
Okay. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, and could we put it on slideshow, please? We need to download it. Is it downloaded?
it already is.
Yeah, it's not opening in. Could you make it a slideshow? No, not that way.
Slideshow.
Is PowerPoint on?
Does anyone know how to do this?
Let me just figure it out. File. Wait.
Just download it.
Yeah, that's what I said. Yeah. Yeah, that's better. Okay, slideshow. From beginning. Okay, so now that we have the PowerPoint up. Yeah.
How do we remove this?
I think we would have to actually hang up, I think.
Oh, that's
Is it okay?
okay.
Is it okay?
I don't care. I mean, if
Okay,
she doesn't
fine.
mind, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is it again? What does that say?
Yeah.
Let's just exit out for now.
Yeah, I think
If
it might
she's
just
still
be
here?
I think it's just the audio that would be on.
Okay.
The video would be.
Can you still hear? Yeah, okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank
And
you.
then could we do from beginning? I'll just do it. Yeah. No. I wanted to do it. Yeah. Yeah. So today's paper is a reflection on the politics of protest in the aftermath of the Delhi gang rape. So as many of you may know, this event on December 16th sparked national outrage. And the paper really is thinking about what does this mean about how protest, who becomes the subject of protest, right? Of why certain actors, why women were marching out on the streets because of this specific event. So that's what the paper is really about and thinking about. And Amrita Basu and I had written an op-ed piece earlier, which was published in Al Jazeera, in which we really thought about the government's non-response to women's voices in the very initial weeks after the event. And then, you know, of course, since then there has been some attempt by the government to take into account the Justice Verma Committee recommendations, etc. But we're not touching on any of that today. So I'm going to read through the paper, and a lot of it is about pictorial representation. So I'm going to be showing you some pictures and slides. The brutal gang rape of a 23-year-old physiotherapy student, Jyoti Singh Pandey, on 16 December in New Delhi sparked nationwide protests. On 18th December, feminist activists and students marched to Chief Minister Sheila Dikshit's house, and police forces hosed down protesters in an effort to disperse them. On 21st December, protesters collected outside Raisina Hills, the seat of parliament and the residence of the President of India. They were lathi-charged and tear gassed by the police. So we have here some pictures of that. There are many. I just chose one. The draconian reaction of the state to peaceful protest ignited a wave of protests in the streets of Kolkata, Bangalore, Chennai, and Mumbai. The protesters included not only feminist activists and students, but also women and men from all walks of life who marched in the streets calling for justice. According to the National Crime Records Bureau, a woman is raped in India every 22 minutes. Why did Jyoti Singh Pandey's rape spark nationwide protests across the socio-economic spectrum? In an interview with LA Times, sociologist Dipankar Gupta claims that the rape represented, quote, a tipping point, a culmination of the government's weak response, the sense that the political class has alienated itself from the rest of the population, and people's anger at the way the police and the system handled the case, end quote. While these factors certainly contributed to the rage of protesters, the incompetency of the legal and judiciary system, police brutality, and the apathy of government figures is not new. Why then did this incident capture the imagination of the people? This question seems to have preoccupied the media as well, as reporters set out to interview protesters to find out why they were protesting. Sangeeta Saini, 44, explained, quote, that girl could have been any one of us. While Anita Chirakatil, a 20-year-old student at St. Stephen's College, argued, quote, that this is the story of every Indian woman, end quote. Similar statements come up in interview after interview, and I read through dozens and dozens and dozens of newspaper articles to actually figure out what was going on over here. It is clear then that Nirbhaya's rape struck a chord with people because she represented every woman. So, I'm calling her Nirbhaya because that was the name given to her in the press before her real name came out, and I'll just be referring to her as that and, talking about what the significance of naming for this particular protest movement. This paper argues that Nirbhaya's representation as every woman by widely divergent social and political actors is contingent on her identity as a Hindu, middle-class, upper caste and urban woman. What might explain the fact that Nirbhaya could represent both middle-class women and all women? In what follows, I examine the discursive production of the category of every woman through pictorial and linguistic representations of the rape victim. In conclusion, I think through the implications of this discourse for gender-based violence in the subcontinent. According to Criminal Law Ordinance 2013, the identity of rape victims is never to be revealed. This ordinance meant that the victim of the Delhi gang rape remained unnamed for several weeks after the incident. In the absence of an official name, newspapers and magazines competed to give the rape victim a name. So here's one. Outlook magazine christened her Jagruti, which is awareness, and there are several of these. I've just chosen one. India Today named her Jyoti, which means the light. Other popular names were Nirbhaya, the fearless, Amanat, treasure, and Damani, lightning. Each of these names claims the nameless victim as a symbol of light, hope, and courage. An article critiquing this renaming of the victim argues that the names, quote, retroactively give her special powers. What happened to her has resonated so sharply is because she is not special. She was just an ordinary nameless woman who boarded a bus to go home after watching a film. We can all relate to that. We should leave it that way, end quote. While the article suggests that the renaming of the victim threatens her status as every woman, I argue that both renaming the woman and leaving her anonymous erase her subjectivity and her agency. As feminist historian Durba Ghosh argues in the context of colonial practices of renaming Native women in colonial documents, the practice of renaming erases a person's past identity to, quote, give way to a new identity and cultural location, end quote. In this instance, the renaming of Jyoti Singh Pandey gives her a new identity which is contingent on the erasure of her original identity. Leaving her nameless performs a similar structural violence because it suggests that her original identity is subsumed by her greater identity as every woman. In both cases, she is created as a symbol of the suffering Indian woman. She continued to signify every woman even after her name was revealed, and protesters continued to rally around her rape. I argue that she continued to represent every woman because of her very specific identity as a middle-class urban woman. Every news article about the rape began with the following story. The rape victim was a physiotherapy student returning from watching a film at a multiplex when she and her friend were induced to board an unnamed bus where the incident unfolded. These details indicate the victim's identity as a middle-class woman who had monetary access to a multiplex, but perhaps not to a privately owned vehicle. In the days that followed, it was revealed that the victim's father had worked all his life to provide her with an education, and that she was the sole breadwinner of the family. This narrative of upward mobility elicits sympathy from the middle-class reader by asking her to recognize ways in which a family's rise to middle-classdom is thwarted by the senseless violence of lower-class elements. Predictably, the complex intersections of gender and class inequalities are erased from this narrative in order to create the subject as simultaneously middle class and as every woman. This view of the victim as urban middle class was further consolidated by pictorial images of her. In the days following the incident, 2 competing photographs of the young woman were circulated on the internet. So this is the photograph, the first photograph. And just look at it carefully. In the first picture, she is portrayed as a slim, light-complexioned woman, fair skin, as Vanita Reddy argues, in the context of Indian beauty pageants, allows women to be Indian, in that fair skin is coded as naturally Indian, but also to simultaneously circulate as objects of beauty in the West. In this picture, the woman's light skin and slight build allow her to be read as beautiful in a global context, while a sari makes her definitively Indian. It is no accident that a sari is a gauzy white, the color associated with virginal purity, while its texture and embroidery connotes affluence. So this is definitely not a sari that a lower middle class woman would own. That's my assessment of this. And here's this. In the second picture, she is once again a slim woman, this time with a darker complexion. She is wearing an unadorned shalwar kurta, her hair is loosely tied, and she smiles unself-consciously at the camera. This suggests that it is an impromptu photograph, and that the woman in the picture is used to having her photograph being taken, and most importantly, that she can afford the luxury of owning a camera and wasting expensive film on impromptu photographs. She's at least middle class. The background of the picture, however, poses another problem. She's framed against trees, and a low-lying, perhaps thatched structure in the background. I couldn't really tell if it was thatched or not. It looks like that. The immediate association is village, yet none of the poverty or dirt of the village are part of the picture. The incongruity of the village setting and the casual pose of the woman suggest an urbanite view of village India, where happy middle-class villagers take casual photographs against scenic beauty. So these are both fake photographs, just to come to that point. In both pictures, however, this is what's important to note, the frame is sliced in half, with one half showing her before the incident and the other hospitalization after the rape. Both images elide the necessary link between the two halves, leaving the viewer to fill in the gap for herself. I am not suggesting here that we need photographic evidence of gang rape or a pornography of violence and pain, but rather that the juxtaposition of before and after images, reminiscent of ads used to sell weight loss products, suggests the transformation of middle-class woman into suffering female body, which is tellingly without any markers of class or status. The victim's body is thus simultaneously marked as middle class and as every woman. Yeah? And both the photographs are fake, so just so we know. And we don't have a photograph of her. Don't know if we ever will, but we don't yet. Similarly, the victim is also rendered as every woman and as Hindu in abstract images of the victim that circulated after the rape. Almost immediately after the rape, a black dot was used to signify this event. And actually, this black dot was on Facebook. And there are several different black dots, so I'm going to show you at least 3 black dots. There are many more. While various slogans were appended to make the sign intelligible, such as black dot of shame, India supports rape victim with black dot, I suggest that the black dot is not an empty signifier, but is linked to Hindu practices of marking women as sexual subjects, which is contingent on their participation or non-participation in conjugality. So this is another image of a black dot, and one more. And there are many black dots with slogans. Traditionally, married Hindu women wear a red dot on the center of their forehead to signify their marital status. A black dot, in contrast, is used to signify widowhood. In the context of the gang rape, the black dot signifies Hindu womanhood destroyed through the loss of sexuality by rape rather than widowhood. Another pictorial representation relies on Hindu iconography to make intelligible the discourse of rape as one of shame. In this painting, published in the Economic Times, the rape victim is covered by the flag of India, while two male arms, the men themselves are faceless and bodiless, try and snatch it off her body while a crowd watches. The scene evokes associations with the Hindu epic, the Mahabharata, where Draupadi, the wife of the Pandavas, was publicly disrobed by the Kauravas while her husband stood by, watching helplessly. In the epic, Draupadi is saved from disrobement and dishonor because she prays to Lord Krishna, who makes her sari an endless garment that cannot be removed. In the painting, however, the woman is draped by the Indian flag, which suggests that the present-day Draupadi, that is the Hindu woman, represents the Indian woman. Alternatively, the Hindu woman here is a symbol of India, and the state watches as a silent spectator while its women are dishonored by significantly faceless men who are therefore unknown and outsiders. In this instance, the state must protect its Hindu women from predatory men, or else suffer shame and dishonor. As the analysis above suggests, the photographic and pictorial images used to depict the victim are coded as middle class and Hindu, even as the victim was touted as every woman by protesters, newspapers, and the media at large. In other words, the construction of the victim as every woman was contingent on her identity as Hindu and middle class. What are the implications of identifying a Hindu middle class woman as every woman? How does this shape our understanding of gender-based violence in India? I briefly consider these questions in the final section of the paper. Since the Delhi gang rape, the media has conscientiously reported rapes as they have occurred all across the country in an attempt to redeem its previous apathy to violence against women. While these rapes have appeared on the front page of newspapers, within a few days the specific case disappears and it is replaced by yet another story of sexual assault. It is evident that none of these cases have captured the public imagination in the same way as the Nirbhaya case. One such case was reported on January 10th on Sky News. Sanyogita, a lower caste woman from Noida, Uttar Pradesh, was raped and dumped onto the roadside. In an interview, Sunita, the victim's mother, argued that there was little hope of getting justice because, quote, "We are lower caste and that is why our voice is never heard. The case against the accused is being watered down because they are rich." So not only are they lower caste, but they're also poor and they live in rural India. So these three things to remember. Sanyogita's rape was reported in a few newspapers, but otherwise largely ignored. No groundswell protest movement erupted in her village. No students and feminist activists marched in the streets demanding justice for her. How do we interpret this silence, especially in the context of the protest movement just a few weeks earlier? I argue that this deafening silence is indicative of the fact that these women do not represent every woman, or actually every woman being Hindu middle-class women, urban women. Just as the Delhi gang rape victim could become every woman because she was middle-class Hindu and lived in urban India, Sanyogita is poor, lower caste, and lives in rural India. She is unlikely to become every woman. Can the subaltern speak? Gayatri Spivak argues that the subaltern cannot speak because her voice has been subsumed by the discourses of patriarchy, imperialism, and nationalism, which purport to represent her. And even greater violence is perpetrated when the subaltern woman's voice is not deemed to exist, where she is silenced by her invisibility. In conclusion, I suggest that if we are to ensure gender justice in India, we need to pay equal attention to the intersecting oppressions of caste, class, region, and religion. We need to replace the narrowly defined category of every woman to actually include women who fall outside the radar of urban protest movements. The specificities of location and of the local are essential to constructing a truly national feminist movement. Thank you. This is a website.
Thank you. And our final speaker, Carole DeSanti. Should we get Sarah back? Yeah, let's bring Sarah back. Sarah. Could someone help me?
Yeah. So, escape.
Okay.
And Skype.
Back to Skype. Maybe?
Yeah.
Here she is.
Yeah.
Hi, Sarah. You're back.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, everyone. It's really lovely to be here. And I really had to smile as I've listened to my four? How many are there? Other presenters, because it really reminds me of being at the center, where I was a completely anomalous kind of person. I work in the publishing industry, and I don't really know exactly how I got to the center, but somehow I did. I think I got something in the mail, and then I gave them money for a few years, and then I thought, well, maybe I should just apply. I was really, really burned out at my job at the time. And, publishing is a little bit like those silk mills, those Skinner's silk, except with a better diet. So we console ourselves with our expense accounts. But otherwise, we're laboring intensively. Anyway, by some sort of fairy god center, godmother, I managed to land here. And it was 1998, 99. And I would just want to say that experience transformed me. It transformed my life. It brought in so many friends and experiences and ideas that I wouldn't have had otherwise as a corporate working person. And I really believe very, very passionately that these places that are really quite rare in our culture and in our country must continue to exist, and we need to enjoy them and have them and be a part of them, and we also really need to support them, because it's something that we need to do to value what we cherish. And these days, places where women can go to find a voice, to do special work that isn't considered by anyone but them, perhaps, to be important, these places are really few and far between, and the center is one of them, and the center's directors and steering committee gave that to me, and carrying it on, I think, is really something great. So it's wonderful to be here, and I'm still an anomaly as the only novelist in the crowd, though this is an intensively researched novel. It is still fiction, and for me as a literary person, it's always been my own feelings about feminism and the women's movement have always been about how the interior self connects to the questions of society and how a society works. In fiction, you find out very quickly that the devil is in the details, and that the details of people's stories have often quite contradictory effects in terms of their actions and how their actions play out. And I mean, especially, I came of age as a feminist in the late 70s and early 80s, and it wasn't so easy to be a literary type of person then, because we were all supposed to be in the streets. And in fact, we needed to be in the streets, and it was important, but if you are not that street-oriented kind of character, it's sometimes hard to find a place. And I had a really interesting experience about history about a couple of weeks ago when I was writing a piece for the Huffington Post about the 50th anniversary of Betty Friedan and the feminine mystique, and my own experience of having been at Smith College and graduating in the early 80s, facing the larger world in terms of what had come before in the wake of the kind of very full flowering of the feminist movement. And as a part of my own cohort, we were ready to kind of reap the rewards of the movement and also extend it. We were quite determined to fulfill our mission as the next sort of wave of the feminist movement. And we didn't understand, and I don't even think I fully understand until I was trying to formulate this piece, that we were about to enter the backlash era. And we were going to have to fundamentally redefine feminism on every level, and we were going to have to dig a whole lot deeper into the questions that were posed. And so I was actually able to become more of a literary person. context, because there you work on the really contradictory material about how experiences play out in the world. So I chose to write about for my first project, which I didn't have any idea how long it was going to take or where it would take me. It takes place in a very conflicted and contradictory time period itself. France under the Second Empire, which was, the novel takes place in the years 1860 to 1871, which is about 30 years after Les Miserables, if that gives you some idea. It was the Madame Bovary era. It was the beginning of the Impressionist movement in art. It was the time when Haussmann was redesigning Paris, and the Napoleon III was the emperor who brought the middle class and bourgeois prosperity to France. So the economy was booming after a real buildup in industry and the railways, and then it all skidded to a halt and dissolved into the Franco-Prussian War, which was followed by a civil war and the Paris Commune period. And in fact, this month, on March 26th, when my paperback is coming out, is the kind of anniversary of the founding of the Commune. So I think that's kind of great, because it's certainly a period in which women really rose up and took both to the streets and to the podiums and started to have a major voice in society. And it was also a period where prostitution was legal, it was tolerated, and it was conducted under a vast medical and police bureaucracy. It was a very split society in which you had a lot of kind of moralistic teaching and training, especially of young women, going on, and an enormous economy of women who made a living in various ways and were serving the needs of men who were just not going to be satisfied by the home, hearth, and family. So at any rate, we have here a novel about this period, and the novel that really is about a woman who is trying to find her own voice in the midst of her society. And it opens in Paris in the year 1871, and I've got her on a train just about at the moment that Paris is about to go up in flames because the Civil War had really come to a crisis. She's not fleeing, though. She's on a mission, actually, to find her daughter. So I'll read a little bit from the beginning. Paris, May 1871. This train, the Aurore, is a night train headed south-southwest. A drape is secured across the window, and behind it is a deep, quiet blackness. The compartment is a box with brass locks, rough napped tapestry, and some silk fringe, fitted with a lamp. Here, one can remove one's gloves, take the knife from the boot, perhaps find again the textures of things or one's own thoughts. Between one place and another, at last, neither here nor there, it is a respite, a still rush of night air. Behind us, the roar of a city on the brink of burning. An hour ago, we stopped for dinner just outside the capital at a cafe counter in a station where the French tricolor flag still flew, and it was strange to see it in place of the Commune's red, the defiant banners and colorful rags that had cropped up across the capital like spring poppies after a long winter. We had a hasty meal, and then the entire body of passengers, Prussian officers included, climbed a low rise to see what we could. Whether on the horizon, a dull red pyre lit the evening sky. Someone had a telescope, and silently among strangers we passed it from hand to hand. From this distance, no sign. The Prussians stood silent. They must certainly be marveling at a Paris again under siege on the heels of what came before. No sound but shuffling footsteps as we headed back to the train. Because I was a girl and am now a woman, I have dreamed some nights. Dreams do their best to reset the soul, but it's heavy work. Dawn or noon or whenever it is one pushes back the bed linens, brings the pressing needs of the day. Those who do not dream or do not remember are able with confidence to say, I think, and so I am, like the philosophers. I might once have said I love, and so I am. And then love was lost to me along with 1,000 other things. How does a woman learn to doubt herself? When does it happen and why? Is it in her blood and bones from birth? Does her mother nurse her on it? Or is the alphabet learned later, then syllable by syllable, a secret language between mind and heart, or an argument between lovers? Ah, but it conjures itself to life, doubt. Preys on the sleeping, it is the infection of everything touched. Sometimes it seems that she cannot answer a single question about her life. Why has it been thus? How did it come to be what it is? And how does she begin to speak when all that has been understood has made any story too difficult to tell, when what is truly desired is so far from possibility, when she has made herself cynical and before that only guessed at what she knew? And then, too, she has spent the days and weeks and years in giving way. When, at what hidden moment was the choice made, and what, in the end, did it yield? There's a lover that she's had to leave behind, which has been the great sadness of her life. And she's borne a daughter by this man and had to give up the daughter at a church where they had the kind of structure at which you could anonymously drop off children. And she's been trying to find some trace of that child, and also make sense of her own life. God, there's so many possibilities. I really am not sure what to read next, but I think that for me, the important matter in all this, even though the plot is important, is also her own desire to find a voice in all of it, and she tries to do that in a number of ways. And at this point, she is reflecting in the book on the ways that she has basically deceived us, the reader. And she pauses in her narrative to kind of cop to that. So this is one of my favorite chapters, and it's called An Ink-Stained Hand. Does the story, in the way that it's told, open a window into the soul's fortress, or place yet another stone to block the view? These events have been related as they unfolded, as accompanied by my feelings at the time, or as I remember them to have been. But every life takes on its wrinkles like lines on the face of an old madam, and who could have foretold her particular destiny in the tracings on a girl's palm? For a while, when not writing wasted love letters, petitions, I squeezed my own suffering down to an inky fingertip. This effort did not come continuously, but in fits and fragments, stained and laden with debris and ill cut from the start, slipping like the awl that leaves an inarticulate scratch. Like Madame Récys's finery mender, I brushed, concealed, restitched, and revised. Eventually, it seemed that even as my life occurred, I had hardly lived it, referring always to an unseen past or future, forever at an impasse, shot through with doubt, assigning both agency and blame to others. And yet, my own words formed another kind of betrayal. Writing was intended to burn and to exercise, but its effect was the reverse. For in writing down, there is no forgetting. In editing, contouring, shaping a thing, what has been omitted looms in the mind. Recorded with pen and ink, blotted and stacked in unruly sheets, the events, both those presented and left unrecounted, were ever with me, as in a dream in which one never runs hard enough to escape the threat. As ink stains water, billowing out and suffusing it, one substance entirely occupies the other until matrix and infusion are one. Thus is suffering formed and transmuted. But meaning accrues slowly, not in a cataclysm, and always unexpectedly. So I'm going to read one more tiny scene, and this is where she actually has reunited with the long lost and greatly yearned for lover. And by this time, she's in a very different social situation. And Stefan, her lover, has been in India for 15 years. See, there are all kinds of resonances here from among us, and they're also in the depths of the siege, which was a time when Paris was completely enclosed and surrounded by Prussian troops, and they had been basically starved out. But there were a few places that still served food. They were clandestine kind of black market restaurants, and that's where these two find themselves. The restaurant's name is Brébant. It was a real place. All this is completely based in fact. Brébant, week 3 of the siege. The menu and the mood, a simulacrum of what it had once been, with white cloths, long mirrors reflecting 1,000 lights, flicker of gas lamps on the wine glasses and the dark window panes. Waiters' feet feathered across the black and white floor, men's dark suits set off the ivory shoulders of their companions. Wines from vineyards now occupied by Prussian guns were uncorked. Silver came and went, and glasses, napkins refolded in the fleur-de-lis, all smooth as clockwork, no clumsiness, no ragged motions here. All around, the murmur of 100 civilized voices. The optimists, the morbid, the war diarists and siege flaneurs, the stenographers of suffering, and elites who had not managed to escape. Meat graced our plates because the grass in the parks had stopped growing when the weather turned, and there was not enough feed hay within the walls to keep the animals that were to be preserved for producing milk and butter. They were slaughtered for meat and sold to the highest bidders. We were aware of these particulars now, where the fillet came from. "Have you noticed," Stefan said calmly, his knife poised, "all of the women are eating instead of pushing food around their plates. Eating, breathing, what will be next? Walking in the street? Perhaps Prussians eating at these tables next week. Bah, never, not while I'm standing. But it is ludicrous. 10 years in the jungles of India, every muscle yearning for civilization, and this is what I come home to be a prisoner in Paris." "What brought you back?" "Business, on behalf of Bengal's blue devil." "Indigo." "Yes, and it is late in the day for saving French fortunes by a dark blue stain." Stefan cut into his fillet. "And I came to face down my own devil." I tasted cautiously, bit into a mélange of carrot and haricot vert, as crisp and buttery as if they were real. Where do you think they are getting these? A jeweler on the Rue de la Paix has turned vegetable dealer, I believe. So here we are, dining well. Stéphane looked up from his plate. I understand, Mademoiselle Rigaud, that you are worth a minor fortune. I've had some advice, good and bad. They say no one knows who your protectors are. You have friends in the highest offices in the city, travel the world under aliases, modeled for a famous painting, and that after this mess is over, you plan to publish your memoirs. Absolutely not. You have my word. So I'll leave you with that. Don't shield us with that. Thank you.